Hello, so for something just a little bit different, I want to talk about the Chinese language, and particularly focusing on general everyday communication. So a little bit of background, I have been to this country twice. This is my second trip. I went back in 2013, both for working purposes, but relatively short periods of time, 6 months then, and I'm on a 6 month contract now. Now, if I was planning to live long term in China, like for years, I would definitely probably put a lot more conscious effort into really learning the language. As it stands, I do want to develop. I'm not beating myself up. I'm not like, you know, exhausting myself every day trying to learn it. But I do want to develop somewhat for a few reasons, practical reasons, also just respectful reasons. I think when you're in another country, you should at least try to pick up the local lingo rather than just always speaking in English. Um, I'm a little bit disappointed at the level that I'm at. It's probably around elementary, probably not even elementary. I can get by insofar as quite a lot of daily exchanges, but I still find that I am relying on others quite a lot. And whilst I'm very grateful for their help, it does make you feel a little bit disappointed in yourself. So I just want to talk about challenges that I found with the Chinese language. Now, when I say Chinese language, I'm talking about modern Putonghua, which is known outside China as Mandarin, Chinese Mandarin, not to be confused with Cantonese, which is another major language, but that is more focused around Guangdong province and Hong Kong. You can, if you listen long enough, pick up some very clear differences between Putonghua and Cantonese in the sound, and so on. A lot of the old kung fu films from the 70s, unless I'm mistaken, were in Cantonese. So that sort of style of that sort of tonology that you hear is Cantonese. Now, Putonghua developed really in the 20th century. It was probably one of the better things the communists done. It developed in the 20th century as a way to kind of get a universal language across China. This is a huge country, and China Chinese history can really be judged as a civilization history rather than a state. What I mean by that is ancient China was made up of various kingdoms, and being the size it is, there's a very large number of dialects. Each province, even cities, have their own dialects. I'm not just talking about accents, I'm talking about full on dialects where the sentence for one simple thing could sound very different from standard Putonghua. Well, okay, not very different, but significantly different. So you could learn fluent Putonghua, really put a lot of effort into it, and then find local people won't necessarily, whether it's that they don't understand or they don't use it, I'm not sure. One phenomenon that I have noticed is that people assume that outsiders won't speak Chinese. So even if you are speaking Chinese, they won't always pick it up. I had a laugh with a friend recently because I said to her something in Chinese and she didn't respond. And I said, "Oh, did I pronounce that wrong?" And she told me that she thought I was speaking English because she was used to me speaking English and her level of English was very high. So it kind of just escaped her notice that I actually had used Chinese. So I said the thing again and she said, "Oh no, your pronunciation was okay." So sometimes you get that phenomenon where people don't expect you to understand the language. Therefore, when you do actually, if you are of quite a high level, they won't necessarily immediately notice. Um, there's a lot of little nuances I want to discuss. Now, the first thing before anything, because this is so important, tones. In Chinese, there is four major tones. There's actually five, but four that we focus on. Now, this is really my Achilles heel. I've always found the four tones a real challenge. Basically, you have a flat tone, or you have a, this isn't in order, but you have an up tone, a down tone, a flat tone, and an up and down tone. Now, every Chinese word, or most Chinese words, will have one of these tones in their pronunciation. And the importance of this cannot be understated. It is so, so important. I had a Dorling Kindersley Chinese phrase book a while back, and it's useless. The reason it's useless is it included the pinyin, which I will come to, but it just totally ignored tones. And you can't do that with Chinese because tones are so important. Now, in English, if you pronounce something wrong, it's flexible enough that you can understand what another person or what an outsider is trying to say, i.e., someone who doesn't speak English as a first language. If their pronunciation, their grammar isn't perfect, if you're paying attention, you can understand what they're trying to say. So English is flexible in that sense. In Chinese, I haven't even got to the point of understanding in-depth grammar rules, so I'm not even going to go into that. But if you don't pronounce something exactly the way it's meant to be pronounced in Putonghua, it could adopt a totally different meaning. Now, in English, there are words that have different meanings that sound the same. Take bear, for example. A bear could be a large, powerful mammal, or it could be to bear responsibility. But you will understand what it means based on the context of the sentence. With Chinese, unless you get the tone exactly right, then people could misunderstand and not know what you're talking about. That I find to be a real challenge. Now, maybe I'm tone deaf, but sometimes people tell me the differences, so they'll say two words, and to me, I think that sounds almost exactly the same. So maybe I have a Achilles heel. Maybe I am actually tone deaf. I don't know, but I I really struggle with that, and it's one thing I would advise anyone who's seriously thinking about learning Chinese. The tones are so important. Now, the words themselves are actually not that difficult. They don't tend to be very long, unlike Japanese words, which tend to be quite long. Chinese words are actually quite sharp. They're quite short and sharp. But the tones, like I say, cannot be underestimated. I'll give an example. There's four provinces. Each of the provinces begin with the letter H. There's actually another one, Hainan. In fact, if you go from the south to the north, almost a direct line, these provinces all border one another. So Hainan Island, that's easy enough, Hainan. But then we have Hunan, Hubei, um, Henan, and Hebei. And I've probably said those last two wrong. That's the problem. So the spelling is a little bit different when you write in Pinyin, but it's it, the Henan and Hunan sound very similar. Now, I suppose an equivalent that we would have in the UK would be if you think of Chester, Chesterfield, Manchester. It's kind of similar. Chester le Street is another one. But with Chinese, I think tones are so very important. So if I can find some way to really master the tones, I believe my spoken ability will get a lot higher. Um, Now, I've mentioned the word pinyin a few times. If you're not familiar with what that is, um, basically pinyin was a writing system that developed in the 1950s. One of the pioneers was a man called Zhou Yu Guang. Zhou Yu Guang passed away last year at the ripe old age of 111. He held in there. But anyone who wants to find an easier way to learn Chinese owes this man a debt of gratitude because, and there were others as well, but he was one of the leading pioneers. Basically, Pinyin is Chinese as you would say it, written in the Roman alphabet, written in Western characters. So, for example, it's not Chinese as we would see the characters as we would imagine Chinese to be, but actually Western characters, Western letters, but the word. So, for instance, Xinyin Kuaile. Xinyin Kuaile means Happy New Year. So, in Pinyin, that would be spelled, I think, Xianinnia Kua, and I think it's Le. I'm not exactly sure about that. But basically, Pinyin is a way of simplifying the language. It's like a bridge between English and Chinese, and it is a godsend. It really is a very, very great development because it makes things enormously helpful. Because if you want someone to write down their name or something, you can just say, "Oh, can you please write that in Pinyin?" If they understand a little English, that is. Hanyu Pinyin to give it its exact title. Now, having said that, I don't know if everyone can understand Pinyin, maybe that's more students and teachers. So the regular Chinese street vendor might not necessarily be able to write something in Pinyin. So Pinyin is great, but doesn't help in every situation. Sometimes you have no choice but to use Chinese characters. In which case, if you're like me and your level is still quite low, you really have no other choice but to get some help. It's a little bit, it's a matter of pride. I don't really like relying on other people too much as I'm grateful for their help. But sometimes you really have no choice and you need to swallow your pride and accept that sometimes you need help. Now, I want to show you another book that I am using at the moment. This is quite a well known book, Chinesey. It's developed by a lady, Xiao Lan, and she was a calligrapher's daughter who resides in Taiwan. I think I've got her name right, but this is a revolutionary method of learning because what she has done is taken everyday images. It's almost using the very ancient Chinese method because in the Shang Dynasty, when the first Chinese writing developed, people basically, Bronze Age people basically used symbology. They used mountains, rivers, fire, and the characters that developed looked somewhat like the real thing. So take this, for example, fire, flame. You sort of see the little symbol, it looks like a lick of flame, right? It's somewhat similar. I'll try and show you a few others. Um, Now, I'm not saying they look exactly like what they mean, but you can sort of picture it. Take this one, tall. So she is showing a picture of a tall man, Chang. Um, so this, I think, will be a very useful thing, and I intend to lap up this book as much as possible. Um, some of the basic symbols like Ren, person, is very straightforward. It's just this. It's just a little, you can imagine two legs. That's one of the simplest Chinese characters. Shan is also pretty simple. My Chinese name actually is Ning Shan, quiet mountain. So Shan is mountain. Again, it looks like what it is, and it's this. So you sort of imagine the base of a mountain. So those are the simple ones. Now, actual sentence structure, putting together compositions, is a lot more complicated. And really, I think you would need to be studying Chinese every day for 2 or 3 years to get to the level where you can construct entire sentences in Chinese characters. And that's okay. Don't be hard on yourself. It's a difficult language. Um, Now, if you're in China for a short term, I don't think it's necessary to learn fluent Chinese, but there are some things that are more complicated than others. Booking tickets for trains or planes can be a little bit complicated, and I've needed help with that. Everyday things like eating out tends to be a lot simpler because, I mean, you could be lazy and just point to the picture, but I do try to work with the Chinese that I know. Wu Yi Bei Mi Fan basically means I would like, let me get this right. Mi Fan is rice noodles. In this province, that's popular. Another thing I would say though, and this is true of any language, a lot of phrase books will teach you very formal Chinese. Wu Yi Bei, I would like. I've heard very few people actually say that. Um, and that again comes into the issue of dialects, which can be a bit tricky because if you're learning formal Putonghua and local people are just, talking in an everyday sense, it's a bit like in the UK and Sunderland, the local people who work in the market are not speaking the Queen's English quite clearly, right? So someone learning formal English in an ELTS exam, they might learn a very polite, very formalized, I would like that tomato, please. Now, the local vendors will understand them, but they're used to speaking very fast and in a certain way. It's the same thing here, and I suspect it's the same thing in any language. So it is useful to pick up colloquialisms. For example, in China, one is kwai. Kwai. Kwai is the equivalent of quid in the UK or bucks in America, just an informal way to say yuan. So the Chinese currency, the unit is yuan. Renminbi is the currency, yuan is the unit. But very few people will say, for example, san yuan, that's 3 yuan, yuan. They would say san kuai. That's far, far, far more common. So I find you learn things as you go along. Put it this way, my Chinese level is quite basic. Dian Dian Zhongwen. That means I only speak a little Chinese. Yet I have more or less got by. Now, without question, there are many things here I could not have done without help. But it's not a case that I've been totally helpless. I have kind of handled my own, so to speak. I remember there was an occasion a friend invited me for dinner with his family. Now, he was in the kitchen, and I was there with his parents, both in their 60s, and his grandfather, who was 90. And they were asking me questions, totally Chinese. These people couldn't speak a word of English, and I handled my own. And I don't mind admitting I was quite proud of myself. I got by. I could just about manage enough Chinese to have a very brief conversation. Um, if you pick up sort of everyday sentences, you can use them enough in a conversation context. You can't go into depth, but I know enough to say, for example, the country I'm from, how old I am, my name, uh, and listening is very important. I would really recommend listening to people, not even just trying to speak, just listen to people. You pick things up. And sometimes I listen to people and I actually understand some of the things that they're saying. You pick things up, Lao Wai, foreigner, um, and you can pick up, like, I remember an old man asked me, did I like China? I forget the exact sentence, but I knew what he was asking. So, wo I need Jongo. I love China, which is true. I do love many things about this country. So, don't panic if your Chinese level is very basic. You're not going to be in the deep end. Also, young Chinese people are very helpful. If anyone speaks a level of English, they'll be willing to help. It's one thing I really like about the Chinese. They're very helpful people. I mean, those who on a working basis. Um, I'm not saying everyone is. I mean, you get sometimes a stubbornness whereby you are using Putonghua and they'll kind of sometimes it can be a little bit, you need to be a little bit wary because sometimes people will literally laugh in your face and you might be tempted to get annoyed and angry. I would caution against that because it's not worth it. I mean, I've just bought some cigarettes and I just pointed to the brand that I wanted, and I'm sure she said something and had a laugh at my expense, but it can be a little bit irritating and it is disrespectful. But to be honest, we get equivalents in the West. Try not to let that sort of thing wear you down because it can. Also, you can misunderstand something because you might think that someone's talking about you in a negative sense. But to be honest, it may be just that for them, it's a curiosity. It's not every day they speak to a foreigner. So try not to take things personally in China because more often than not, it's just that they are not used to speaking to foreigners. Maybe it's nervous laughter. So that's the approach I tend to take. Okay, I hope this has been quite useful. So learning Chinese, the best I can advise is listen to people. Definitely utilize Pinyin. Don't be too hard on yourself, but do try. It's like any language. I always say to my students when I'm teaching English, try. Well, it's the same principle of Chinese, just try. But it is a tricky language, and the tones are so very important. They always say like it's ma, ma, something like that. But I find to me that is the hardest part of Chinese. It's not the words, it's not even the Chinese characters because you don't need to worry about that until later on anyway. Most big cities have some English on their signs and have some people who can speak a degree of English. So what I find is the biggest challenge is those tones, and I'm still struggling with them. I want to find some way that I could get my head around. Maybe I'm tone deaf, so maybe I'll never be able to utilize them, which is frustrating. But that's Chinese. So I hope this video has been in useful. There's a lot of Chinese videos online, incidentally. Some very good teachers out there. I recommend watching them. If you have a VPN in this country, you can use YouTube. Those videos are enormously helpful. Do try and spend a little time. I mean, I haven't been disciplined. I really should be spending more time every day just picking up a little bit, and I haven't been doing that because I've kind of taken it for granted that there are many things that I could get by in. Travel is a bit more complex. You will need help with that. Okay, if you've any questions, I'll try and answer. Thanks for watching.